The good economic news. The day's obvious question, though, remained unanswered.
Mr. Major, why don't you sack these ministers?
Lady Thatcher's presence was perhaps unfortunate, reminding people not only of Tory divisions on Europe, but also of a very different leadership style.
Why don't you sack these ministers, Mr. Major? Why don't you sack Mr. Place and Mr. Horan?
Dealt with all that at the press conference, weren't you there?
Why don't you sack them?
Weren't you there?
Don't we need the smack of firm government? Like the message, Lady Thatcher would have sacked them.
These ministers, or do you agree with them?
Wouldn't she? She would have given the smack of firm government, surely.
There we are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Why don't you sack them?
Still no answer. So at lunchtime, we tried again.
Couldn't somebody tell Michael we've done with this at the press conference this morning?
Deal with it at the press conference this morning.
By now, Mr. Major and his entourage were getting pretty upset.
It's a question we've been trying to ask the Prime Minister all day. And now Conservative Party officials are intimating that if we persist in asking it, they might have to restrict the BBC's access to this particular trip.
But at least we got some response from one of Mr. Major's more obedient junior ministers who'd been with him and Lady Thatcher today.
Do you think she sympathises with his problem over these dissident ministers?
I just think she fears for what will happen in Britain if there is ever a Labour government. And I share that fear, and everybody does.
Do you think she supports the Prime Minister in deciding to take a lenient attitude to Mr. Place and Mr. Horan?
I'm sure she's for them.
And at his next stop in a marketplace, Mr. Major seemed to seize his party's latest problems, actually to go on the offensive over Europe.
Should we go into what has become known as a federal Europe? No. No. The answer to that question, I believe, is no.
The Prime Minister was in surprisingly high spirits, while one of his more pro-European Westminster colleagues appeared to welcome the new debate sparked by the Tories' troubles.
I think you'll find that there is a lot of concern about Europe and the way things are going with this country going further on into a federal Europe. And a lot of people here want these issues discussed. They don't want silence on this issue. They want us to discuss it.
Yes.
Is anybody here not concerned about what's going on with Europe?
No.
There you are, you see? But the public want us to discuss this issue.
But do the public expect, though, that ministers will step out of line when they're told that they've got to abide by the
They want to know.
manifesto?
They want to know our policies on Europe. What people ask me on the doorstep. They want to know what my view is on Europe.
As the Tory leader met party workers this evening, our attempts to ask further questions were hindered by a band of young men and women in pale blue sweatshirts.
Mr. Major, can I just ask you?
How could he keep John Horam and James Pace in office, we wondered, if they'd been unwise and foolish, in Mr. Major's words this morning. This time, no question, let alone an answer.
Mr. Major. Mr. Major, why are all these heavies trying to stop me asking you a question?
He'd evaded such questions today. It'll be harder to avoid the underlying issue.
Michael Crick with the Prime Minister. Well, I'm joined now from Edinburgh by Malcolm Rifkind. Malcolm Rifkind, why could John Major not bring himself to sack John Horam and James Pace?
I'm sorry your reporter had such a difficult task. Let me try and be of assistance to you. The Prime Minister said that John Horam and Jim Pace had been unwise because inevitably their remarks created confusion yesterday as to whether they did in fact support collective responsibility and the governments negotiate and decide policy. Now, both ministers have said quite explicitly they do support the view that we must negotiate and only then take a final decision as to whether we should join the single currency. Indeed, John Horam went on to say that if that was not his view, he wouldn't have remained in the government. So they've clarified their position. Their position is that they do accept collective responsibility, and therefore there is no reason for them to leave the government.
John Horam's election leaflet still says that he doesn't want to be any part of a single currency. That surely is in defiance, deliberate defiance of the Prime Minister. He knew what he was writing in his election leaflet. Surely the Prime Minister should be firm, be a leader, and show that he won't brook that kind of dissent.
Just calm down a moment, Kirsty. You've got to look at the full comments that John Horam actually said. You're right, he made these remarks, but he also went on to say...
He stands by them.
Well, hold on a moment. You want an answer. You've been trying to get an answer all day. Let me try and give you one. He did make these remarks, but he also added that he fully accepts that no final decision should be taken on these matters until the negotiations within Europe have been concluded, because no European country is going to take a final decision on whether it meets the convergence criteria, whether it can join a single currency, probably till about March of next year. And therefore, as John Horam recognises, that is therefore a decision that will be taken later. He has said he is quite content that the decision and his own involvement in the government should continue on that basis.
Malcolm Rifkind, only last month, John Meacher told Newsnight it was a complete fantasy that a minister, any minister, would come out against a single currency. It's not a fantasy now, it's a reality, and John Meacher has absolutely done nothing about it.
No, absolutely wrong, if I may say so. I know you're trying to be controversial because that's your job, but it's not quite as dramatic as you're making it sound. The government has a policy, which is negotiate and decide. That is a view which all members of the government have to accept, because that's part of our constitution.
John Horam did not put that in his election address.
Please let me finish. I know, that's not the point.
But it is the point. It's what he's telling his constituents.
With respect, I wonder, are you suggesting to me that Robin Cook in his election address has said he supports privatisation that Tony Blair is now calling for? Is John Prescott going to put in his election address that he wants the trade union reform that Tony Blair has endorsed? Of course they haven't.
Well, let me put it another way.
Are they going to be sacked from the shadow cabinet?
Let me put it another way.
I wait with relish to find out.
John Meacher also said today the important thing was that John Horam was a minister, but he wouldn't be negotiating in Brussels. Correct. So therefore he wasn't going to be facing other members of the European community across the negotiating table. Neither will 97% of his ministers. So presumably, if Peter Lilly wants to put similar things in his election address, he won't be slapped down either.
No, you've misunderstood exactly what the Prime Minister was saying. What he was saying is precisely for those reasons, ministers who are not directly involved in European negotiations should be very cautious, should be very careful about what they say, because it can cause confusion. And there was confusion, and that's why we're having this discussion this evening. But that's why it required clarification, and I'm glad that's now happened.
Well, in fact, you haven't clarified it, because we have James Pace, we have John Horam, we have Eric Forth, we have Roger Evans. There's no saying who will come next. By the very fact that John Meacher did not take decisive action, surely that means the floodgates can now open.
You like to have blood on the carpet. That's part of your trade, and that makes good news and good copy. But the question really is the national interest. Now, the Constitution of the United Kingdom is very clear, collective responsibility. And if John Horam or Jim Pace or any minister of the government could not accept that it is to negotiate and then decide on single currency, if they couldn't accept that, they couldn't, as they themselves have acknowledged, stay in the government. That's why David Heathcote-Amery resigned, because he disagreed with the policy. So that's perfectly reasonable. What I freely acknowledge, and what the two ministers have acknowledged, was that they made additional remarks yesterday which cast doubt on whether they did accept government policy. That has now been clarified, and on that basis they can continue in the government.
That was yesterday, but today they were branded as unwise. Are you, as Foreign Secretary, and indeed you think John Meacher as Prime Minister, are comfortable about having ministers in your government who you think are unwise?
Well, of course, look, I think you can allow somebody to make an unwise remark.
In the middle of an election campaign?
Well, I'd wish they hadn't, and they obviously wish they hadn't. That's the point. It's not a sackable offence to make a mistake and say something you perhaps prefer not to have said. The crucial question when it comes to whether you continue in the government, obviously if you make a habit of making foolish remarks, then it's unlikely you'd be seen as suitable ministerial calibre. But I'm sure in the BBC, just occasionally, even you, Kirsty, might have made a mistake without expecting to be sacked for it.
We don't wield any power, though.
I know, that's one of the misfortunes of life.
We'll speak to you again in a moment, Malcolm Rifkind.
Thank you very much.
John Meacher tried to make a virtue out of a necessity, turning his press conference into a passionate exposition of the pros and cons of the single currency, and holding fast to the manifesto line. His plea to the party, "Don't tie my hands." Tonight, he repeated it in a hastily written and even more quickly cobbled together election broadcast. Mark Mardell reports on the day Europe really took off.
Early this morning, the Prime Minister went to Conservative headquarters in a determined mood. He binned the prepared text of the day, scrapped tonight's planned election broadcast, and prepared to put his own personal stamp on the European issue to drive the story of ministerial insubordination out of the headlines. Perhaps his meeting with the European enthusiasts, the Chancellor and the Deputy Prime Minister, had its effect.
Let us suppose a single currency were to proceed and were to be successful, and were to deliver right the way across Europe a zone of low inflation, not just in the short term, but in the long term. The impact upon the living standards, quality of life of people right the way across Europe would be immeasurably improved.
This was the most electric, most unusual moment of the campaign so far. It was an unfamiliar John Meacher, passionate, eloquent. It sounded like the speech of a condemned man appealing to a higher power, proclaiming his virtue in the face of certain extinction. He said the single currency could mean damage beyond calculation, and he knew all about getting big decisions wrong.
I was the Chancellor when we went into the exchange rate mechanism. Don't think I'm not scarred by the fact that following the view of the markets, the fashionable opinion of the day, the opinion, dare I say it, of many of the people seated here in this room, that we should enter. But I took the decision that we should go into that, and it fell apart, and it caused damage. Don't think that I'm not scarred by having taken that decision.
Mr Meacher was uttering words that haven't crossed Conservative lips in many months. Not even the Chancellor has dared put such a positive glow on the case for a single currency.
Can anyone be absolutely certain that that huge flood of inward investment would continue if a successful European currency was operating and working for years and we were outside it?
The Prime Minister's whole purpose was to explain why he couldn't rule out a single currency. But Conservative strategists were worried he'd gone on too long about the possible benefits and sounded too positive. Two different sources confided, you know his instincts are sceptical, very sceptical. So when it came to the TV broadcast, an insipid repetition of his gripping speech, the positive bits had been edited out.
If a single currency were to be formed, and if it were to be successful, it might extend a zone of low inflation permanently right across Europe. But are there risks? Yes, there are very deep risks, and we have to consider...
However, his strategists want him to sound John Meacher is a player of games who doesn't want to close down the party's options in Europe.
If I set out precisely what I would do in detail, they would know precisely how to respond to it. Everybody in this country who plays cards would never put their cards face up on the table and then expect to win the game.
The trouble for the Prime Minister is backbenchers and ministers are making it quite clear what cards he does hold, rather weak ones. With their manifestos and their outbursts, are Mr Meacher's options really open?
If there was a fifth term of Conservative government, I don't think it would matter who was Prime Minister in terms of the extent to which he or she would be limited by the stance that has been taken by so many candidates during this election campaign. To some extent, the party leaders' hands would be almost tied to the extent that it would be virtually impossible for a Conservative Prime Minister to take Britain in the next Parliament, anyway, into a single currency.
Not for you? Yeah.
At least 102 candidates have declared against a single currency, suggesting wait and see is a sham. One minister said he might have to resign if a Conservative cabinet recommended a single currency.
If I agreed with the decision that had been reached collectively, that would be fine. But if I didn't, it is the sort of issue on which I would feel obliged to back my own judgment, and of course the consequence of that if I was in government would be that I would have to resign.
Eric Forth was also pretty unhelpful.
One of your election leaflets says you oppose any further transfers of powers from Britain to Europe. That must rule out a single currency.
That's what my literature says, and I stand by it.
No one can accuse Labour of being too subtle or subliminal about their message that they too would stand up for Britain while having a good laugh at Tory troubles.
I think the Tory Eurosceptics represent the Tory militant tendency. They're a party within a party with their own separate platform and programme.
A party that can't agree with itself and a government that is at war with itself cannot prosecute Britain's interests in the future. It's one of the key reasons why this government really has to go.
But it was John Meacher himself who put his finger on the problem.
Can anybody honestly put their hand on their heart and say that they know for certain what the outcome would be if we were to decide now precipitately, without the details at this moment, that never in any circumstances were we going to decide to enter a European currency?
The answer is very many Conservatives.
I believe, hand on heart, that the Conservative Party in government is not likely to take us in, because I think the factors are so balanced against a single currency that they will make that decision as a clear judgment when the moment comes. But that's my opinion. The government will, of course, have to arrive at that opinion in due course.
We must negotiate and decide...
John Meacher's words today appear to come from the heart, but one suspects some are waging the war to be fought after the election. Despite their grave internal injuries, the Conservatives will tomorrow again highlight Europe with a new set of posters on the issue, but it may damage them more than their opponents.
Mark Mardell will be discussing the Tory wait-and-see policy with the Foreign Secretary in a moment. But first, despite Tony Blair's admission of a degree of sorrow for John Meacher's position, his insistence today that his party is a united party is showing signs of strain. One former Labour minister today stated his opposition to the single currency. And as Martha Kearney reports, there are signs of discontent amongst the party's grassroots, which look set to break out once the election has passed.
closely guarded by Gordon Brown, there was an unusual sight this morning. A left-winger at a Labour press conference. Before the last election, Michael Meacher, not just a Eurosceptic but also a classical scholar, quoted a Roman author to me. "With each day my bonds grow tighter." Then he was referring to Neil Kinnock. Today it was Gordon Brown pulling his chain.
I am very happy with the position which is set out in the manifesto, which is, I don't know why you're laughing, which is very clearly, which is that...
maybe you want him to read the manifesto to you.
I hope you've read our manifesto. It seems I'm very glad to hear it. It seems the only sensible way in which to proceed, which is to look at our national economic interest at the time when the decision is made. That seems absolutely sensible, and I'm absolutely certain that every member of the Labour Party, of the Parliamentary Labour Party, does support that position.
Bit of a hostage to fortune, that. Later today, former Treasury Minister DENZIL Davies wrote in his election address that he was opposed to a single currency.
Within the Labour Party, there is still a very deep concern about the single currency. There's deep concern about public expenditure. We are very concerned about the levels of public expenditure. There's deep concern about handing over power, more power, to the financial markets. These are traditional Labour views, and they go right across the party, from old Labour, if you want to call it that, to new Labour. So there will be very real concerns on the single currency.
Until today's developments, Labour's campaign headquarters here at Millbank Tower have been pretty successful in maintaining a united front over Europe. Dissident MPs were worried about having the whip withdrawn after the election. Even troublesome journalists have been warned to keep quiet. But although Labour's divisions over Europe may not be as open or as bitter as the Conservative parties, behind the scenes, Labour grassroots are preparing to do battle over a single currency.
There you go, Pat. So that's why we ask people to support the march.
A special series of marches against economic and monetary union is currently being planned right across Europe. Trade unionists in Jarrow will join thousands of others from the EU in a mass protest at the Intergovernmental Conference in Amsterdam. The campaign is headed by left-wing Labour politician Alan Simpson, backed by Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn.
London at last.
In the same spirit as the Jarrow marches of the 1930s, trade unionists from all over Britain will be demonstrating about unemployment, which they fear would rise with a single currency. But this traditional Labour cause is being spurned by the modern leadership, according to a local church leader who's supporting the march.
I think that the Labour Party has really become rather more right-wing than it used to be. And maybe at the moment it's more concerned to get elected than actually to address the issues that bother so many of us.
The march organisers are also meeting opposition from new Labour allies at the TUC. One local TUC region, the North West, supported the march and was then told by the TUC General Secretary to back off. In a letter circulated nationally, John Monks wrote, "We have established that the platform on which this initiative is based is at considerable variance with that adopted by Congress." He added, "The General Council should firmly oppose the anti-Maastricht march." But the local region has just voted to defy the TUC leadership. Executive member Alec McFadden is suspicious of the national motives.
Thousands of trade unionists and many prospective Labour candidates have been persuaded by the hierarchy in both the Labour Party and in the TUC to be as quiet as possible and to say as little as possible so that the Labour Party can continue to woo the votes of the middle class in the south of England.
The TUC told us it believes the UK will be better off inside EMU than outside, but is campaigning for the inclusion of an employment chapter in the Maastricht Treaty to provide security and jobs for Europe's people. But TUC opposition to the march fits into a broader political picture, according to one trade union convener in London.
There is a direct relationship between the debate about economic policy, particularly public expenditure policy, that's taking place in the Labour Party and in some of the trade unions at the moment, and the opposition to the march itself. Because those of us who support the march clearly believe that we need to expand public services, and we would need to do that by increasing taxation on some of the people who could afford it. And that's diametrically opposed to Labour front bench policy at the moment. And I think that there is a close working relationship between people like John Monks and some of the people on the front bench, and that's why I think they'd like to see the march go away.
Grassroots opposition to Labour's policy on Europe will get a public airing this weekend at the Scottish Trades Union Congress.
The more we examine the convergence criteria, the possible impact of a single currency, the more obvious it is that it's going to affect our people in their homes, their hospitals, their schools, their jobs, their pay packets. It's going to affect every aspect of their lives. I think realistically, both political parties are not going to encourage an inner-party debate in the middle of a general election campaign, although the Tories are finding it impossible to stop it happening. Once we get to the far side of the election, it's inevitable that the debate will take place.
As Tony Blair campaigned today, he'll have been cheered by Tory disarray on Europe. But he also knows that the election has stifled dissent in his own ranks, a truce which won't last after May 1st.
Martha Kearney, well, I'm joined now from Bristol by Labour's Alistair Darling, by Alex Carlile of the Liberal Democrats here, and again by Malcolm Rifkind in Edinburgh. Malcolm Rifkind, let's deal in a moment with Labour's potential time bomb. But today we heard John Major being more passionate than ever before in a positive attitude towards a single currency, balanced up, of course, by a negative one, but much more positive about that. You now hear that John Horam has been honest with his voters in saying that he opposes a single currency. Surely, if Conservatives come to government again, John Horam's honour bound to vote as his constituents expect him to vote.
Well, any member of the government is bound by collective responsibility of that government. That's true of a Labour as well as of a Conservative government. And if you disagree with the policy of the government, you resign from it. That's the honourable thing to do. What the Prime Minister was making clear today is that the negotiate and decide policy is not just a matter of convenience. It's something that actually the Prime Minister and the government believe in, because there is no national interest that requires a decision now. There are national interests that would suffer by a rushed judgment. And I was interested that yesterday, an opinion poll published yesterday showed that 72% of the British public agree with the government that negotiate and decide is a much more sensible policy than rushing to a decision at this moment.
But if it is the case that more than 200 Conservative candidates are going to put an anti-single currency position in their election leaflets, they obviously believe that the voters will buy that, which is a direct contradiction to what you're saying.
Well, I've seen a number of these, and what, of course, a number are saying is that they personally are not keen on a single currency, but they recognise that the government has to consider the national interest, and that they acknowledge that the national interest justifies a negotiate and then decide policy. And I'm very pleased that they're making that clear.
But isn't it the case that if you have as many people as that saying...
That's your figure. That's not a figure that has yet been confirmed by any means.
Well, let's say we have another Conservative government, and indeed the triple lock. Parliament does have to vote for it. Backbenchers, they will vote against it in their droves, and then there'll be further division.
Well, certainly if there was ever to be a question of Britain joining the single currency, it would have to be approved by Parliament. But we believe that because a single currency would be a historic and probably irreversible decision, it shouldn't just be a decision taken by politicians. And that's why we committed ourselves that if any future government wanted to join a single currency, it not only has to be approved by Parliament, but there should be a referendum so that every citizen in this country should be able to participate in taking such a decision.
But the referendum would only happen after Parliament had decided. And how could they, in all conscience, vote for it if they'd already made up their minds now, going into a crucial election, that they were against it?
Well, each individual MP has to be answerable to his own electorate and will have to make such explanation as is required of the way they respond. That's the nature of parliamentary democracy. A decision will be taken in the House of Commons in the first instance, and however any MP, including I as a minister, might vote, I will have to justify that to my constituents.
Alistair Darling, Michael Meacher was brought out today and duly spoke the party line, perhaps fingers and toes crossed. But then we have had further dissent today, and of course the news that there are elements of the trade union movement who are deeply unhappy with the firm lid that's being put on discussion within the Labour Party in this election period.
Well, I think your report was rather clutching at straws there. With respect, I don't think you can really compare one MP, DENZIL DAVIES, with the situation that the Tories have now got, where the Prime Minister effectively had to abandon his election campaign today and to speak not to the country about the issues facing us, but to his own party, which is now in open revolt against him. And, you know, he's talking about the difficulties he might have in negotiating, but he has, in effect, been stripped naked by his own political party. What on earth is Europe, with whom we are going to have some hard negotiations over the next few months and years, going to make of a Prime Minister who has to deal with a political party, his own party, which is in open defiance. Indeed, even members of his own cabinet. You saw Peter Lilly yesterday, who could hardly contain his scepticism on the stage. And the difficulty with the Tories appears to be that they're not so much fighting the general election, and they're laying out their stalls for the battle that's going to come in the Tory party after the election, the next leadership election. So really, I don't think you can compare the two political parties at all. One has lost control of itself and is disintegrating. In contrast, the Labour Party is prepared and is ready to give a lead in Europe so that we can negotiate the best possible position for this country.
But you heard what Bill Spears said there, that you'll all sit tight to the election, and if you do win, then the debate will open up again. Isn't it simply the case that in this pre-election period, as John Major says, the desperation for power is such that the iron grip is on the party, and so far, barring DENZIL Davies, the iron grip is working?
No, there's no iron grip. Our party and the candidates standing for the Labour Party in this election are, with the odd exception, signed up and support our policy. And in particular, all the shadow ministers that support the party's policy, which is to keep our options open, which the majority of people in this country, inside and outside mainstream politics, thinks is the right solution for this country. But I repeat the point, you know, John Major said a couple of weeks ago that it would be fantastic if any minister came out against him. Ministers are now openly in revolt. His own political party, perhaps a third to a half of the candidates standing in this election under the Tory colours, are in revolt against the Prime Minister. You know, how on earth is someone like that trying to represent the country when he can't even control his own party? You know, his broadcast tonight was an appeal to 640 Tory party candidates, not to the country. Now, with a shambles like that, how on earth can anyone have any confidence in the Conservative Party's ability to govern, let alone stand up for Europe in what will be very hard, very difficult discussions and negotiations that we'll have to have over the next period? Well,
we'll put that back to Malcolm Rifkind in a moment. So, Alex Carlile, can negotiate and see, or even wait and see, arguing both sides, continue to survive?
Well, it's certainly not going to survive in the Conservative version of it. The Conservative Party is looking like a pit of snakes speaking with forked tongues, and I'm afraid John Horam is a very good example of that. You've said that he's being honest with his electors by saying, I'm opposed to the euro, but I have actually got here a letter that John Horam, the same John Horam, in the same party, wrote to one of his constituents in late 1992. In the long run, the best solution for Britain, he said, is to be part of a single European market with a single European currency managed by a single European central bank. He said that he, a Conservative, then wanted to reapply for entry to what, I quote, I hope by then will be a single currency European Union, unquote. And he asked for, quote, strong and intelligent political leadership. That's his letter. Now, that, I'm afraid, is a typical example of the desperation with which Conservative MPs are clawing in their constituencies to try and say whatever they imagine the public want that day.
Malcolm Rifkind, did you know that John Horam was an absolute rabid Europhile in 1992, all the way to a central bank?
These are matters you better put to John Horam. I'm not familiar with his correspondence of 4 years ago.
But doesn't it bring a greater point to bear that you cannot keep looking in both directions? Because what ends up happening is your candidates are scrabbling to jump on the right ship, that you aren't giving firm leadership.
Well, look, you know, there are differences of view in my party, that's true, of course. There's equally differences of view in the Labour Party, and I listened with a growing amusement to what Alistair Darling was saying, because actually it's not just one or two. We know there are 50 Labour MPs. They went public 6 months ago. They've all been told to behave like Trappist monks during the election. But 6 months ago, they published a document attacking Tony Blair. So let me finish. Attacking Tony Blair on the single currency and making it clear they would strongly oppose it. And I remember when I was on your programme with Robin Cook last week, it was revealed that Labour MPs wanted to come onto that same programme and disagree with Robin Cook, and he was refusing to appear with them. Such is the desperate desire of the Labour Party that the public should not be aware of the views of Labour candidates. That's not very democratic, but if that's what Tony Blair means by trust me, well, God help the country.
But only last month, as I said earlier, John Major was talking about it being a fantasy that any minister would come out with anything other than what's in the National Manifesto. Presumably he would have preferred these 4 ministers to behave like Trappist monks too.
Well, I thought we had that discussion earlier, and I pointed out to you, but I'm happy to explain it again, that John Horam has made clear that he supports the negotiate and decide policy. If he didn't support it, of course he couldn't stay in the government.
Everything, Malcolm.
But Alistair Darling, moving back to look at what is happening among elements of the trade union movement, there are serious concerns about employment, about taxation within your own ranks that you will have to address sooner rather than later.
Well, I don't think you've got any evidence for that. You know, you can go around the country and you'll find someone to say anything. But, you know, let's come back to the central point. At this election, people are going to be electing a political party, and they need to know where a party stands on Europe as in other matters. Now, the difficulties the Tories have got is that they say their official policy is that they're going to keep their options open. Well, that's fine. The difficulty is that perhaps half their party have already shut those options off. Now, you know, this is an important matter. The single currency, if it were ever to go ahead, is an important matter. How on earth can any would-be government argue the British case, argue about our concerns in Europe, if it is so divided that it can't deliver? You know, it just wouldn't be taken seriously. As I said earlier, John Major, if he were ever in that position, if he were going in to negotiate, wouldn't be taken seriously, because everybody in Europe can see that what's happening today, they can see what the Tories are saying, and the fact is the Tories are hopelessly divided on Europe.
Right, Alistair Darling, let me put that to Malcolm Rifkind. Let me put that to Malcolm Rifkind. Indeed, your policy is in a shambles simply because, as Alistair Darling says, there are deep divisions and substantial numbers who are firmly against the single currency. Can you deny that there are substantial numbers against the single currency?
With respect, the whole country knows perfectly well that the Labour Parliamentary Party is also deeply divided, but until May the 2nd... Hold on. But until May the 2nd, they are so desperate for power that they're going to deny any ability for the electorate to be informed of this. And once the election is over, because we know this, Dennis Skinner has said it, Jeremy Corbyn, Tony Benn, the trade unions, including Bill Spears, whom you interviewed earlier, have all made clear, come May the 2nd, if there's a Labour government, then the battle royal begins.
Well, there's a long way till then.
The one people who will not